This week on Life and Faith.
They felt that they were basically fodder for generating exam results which would enable the school to say we are a high-performing school.
I think it also transforms the citizen-consumer relationship.
I'm never going to try and tell someone they're wrong or why they should believe what I believe.
I had a very profound realisation.
To give up shopping is going to be a hard task.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. When it comes to education, everyone seems to have an opinion. Everyone went to school, so of course they know how education should look, what it should be for, and what's wrong with whatever current system they or their kids are experiencing. And actually, it's understandable and right that this topic garners so much opinion and strongly held ideas. In my city of Sydney, it's a topic of great interest. The Sydney Morning Herald has stories on education, it seems, every week. And when it comes to introducing religion into education, well, things tend to get decidedly controversial. Our guest today has spent his whole career in education and working on the way religious education in both public and independent schooling can make a vital contribution to whole person formation. Trevor Cooling is Professor Emeritus of Christian Education at Canterbury Christ Church University in the UK and was the chair of the Religious Education Council of England and Wales. He was in Australia as the guest of Shaw School and spoke at a bunch of conferences, one of which I attended. And it was great to hear what he had to say, and I'm glad to have you hear something from him too. I began our conversation by asking Trevor what is his view of the purpose of education.
I think it should be one of the most shaping experiences in a person's life. And to me, it's about them understanding their place in the world, understanding what contribution they can make, understanding their gifts, and knowing how to develop those, I would say, for the benefit of the whole community. That would be my vision for education.
There are different visions, right, for education. Some people, it's a very sort of instrumentalist thing where you're being trained to be a useful contributor to the economy.
Yeah.
That's always felt a bit limiting to me. Do you agree with that?
I do, and I'm worried about the idea that education is simply about getting the best paid career you can, and certainly in the UK, that's one of our government's philosophies. It's all about the economic benefit.
And that's a sort of overt thing,
it's very overt, yes. Yeah. I mean, they actually measure universities' performance on the salaries of their graduates, which seems to me to be a pretty limited view.
What's the challenge to that way of thinking of education?
I think it's to do with what I would call vocation, about pupils, students finding their vocation, which means understanding their own gifts and their abilities and thinking about what's the contribution I'm making as well as what's the benefit I'm experiencing. So it's a reframing of purpose, really.
Is it a big challenge to reframe it for the people who are in powerful positions?
Oh, it is. And it's often a big challenge for parents as well, because naturally parents' economic security sort of matters to them. And understandably, I mean, I'm a parent, I get that. But there is much more to life. And I meet a lot of young people at the age of about 30 who've done the money-making bit and realise actually they need to find something that's going to sustain them for the rest of their life.
Yeah. One of my son's friends has recently left a degree in some sort of business degree to go to art school. And he's a very talented artist. I can sense some anxiety from his mum and dad, though. Yes. They might have some reason for that, might they not?
Yeah, and I think also I don't want to deride business because it's important, but it's knowing that there's more to business than a bottom line on an account sheet.
Yeah, and especially if that's not who you're wired up to be.
Yeah.
And your idea of vocation suggests a calling, doesn't it?
It does.
Sense of,
this
is who I am, I'm this kind of person. And I think wise people would tell us that if you end up in a career that is in harmony with your interests and loves and passions, then it doesn't feel like too much heavy labour. It feels like you're really being who you're meant to be.
Yeah, it's about finding where I'm meant to be. And that, of course, that applies to everybody. It's not just a small group of people who have a vocation, because sometimes that word gets sort of narrowed down to vicars or something like that. But it's,
Yes.
it's actually part of being human,
The
I think.
doctors. Yeah, it's more who you're wired up to be.
Yeah, yeah.
What makes you so passionate about education, which you must be? You've been in it a long time. Do you still get excited, motivated by things the difference you can make?
Yeah, it's seeing young people come alive. I've done a lot of adult education. It's seeing people suddenly sort of things click for them and they begin to understand things. I mean, I'm retired now, but my last 10 years were involved with working with doctoral students, and that was a fantastic experience in the sense that you went on a journey with people, and it was often a journey full of tears and frustrations.
Yes.
But you see them discover something really important to them in their life. That's a privilege.
Did they often discover something that wasn't really part of the original plan? It's like a surprise.
Oh, yes, that often happens, yeah.
Now, I want to think about the scene of education in Australia. So I'm especially thinking of schools, but there's a big independent sector of education in Australia. Most of those schools are faith-based schools. But I wonder, what is that independent sector of education contributing that the state must be glad of?
I think it's to do with the broader sense of what it is to be a human being, because the independent sector has the opportunity to do a lot more in the co-curricular, often have smaller classes, so there's more opportunity for pupil interaction. There's often a lot of emphasis on going away on a journey or a camp and that sort of thing, which the public sector, they would struggle more to do because of resourcing issues, although the teachers might love to do it if they could.
Yeah.
So I think it's that sort of holistic sense and a move away from it being just the classroom, and also having more space in the classroom to explore things that are of particular interest and relevance.
Now, at its best, what kind of contribution does a school that's Christian make to the common good of a society?
I would go back to my vocation notion and picking up the idea that young people in Christian belief are all made in the image of God. They all have skills and gifts and abilities. They all have a contribution to make. And it's the nurturing of that contribution within sort of a Christian ethos, but without it being, if you like, an imposition on the student. So it's a nurturing ethos that they provide.
Yeah, because huge numbers of people who are not Christian send their children to these schools. And I wonder if you could comment on the notion of hospitality, in that the way these schools are seeing themselves in relation to the general community, who very often come to them for reasons other than the faith that's proclaimed there.
Yeah, that's becoming a key idea now in thinking about what schools that have a Christian foundation and ethos are providing. And it's a sense that you're creating a community where students can really flourish and can find out where they are gifted and can see how they can contribute to both their own future and the rest of society by what they do in the future. So it's all about that sort of offering up a place of nurture, if you like. That's one way of putting it.
Yes, it's not without controversy, is it? In the sense that some people will fear that a school with a faith base is or could be in danger of indoctrinating children rather than something better than that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a genuine concern. And one of my roles, being in Australia and working with the independent schools, is to encourage them not to develop that sort of mentality where they see it as a sort of, if you like, a battle for pew fodder. You know, you're trying to just fill the churches. That isn't the contribution that seems to me that certainly a school that's got public funds coming into it is there primarily to fulfill. A Christian school is offering a place of nurture and safety for everybody in that community, not just those
who can afford it.
Who can afford it? Yeah, I mean, that is an issue.
Yeah,
because there are still lots of people who can't afford that benefit, which is why I believe passionately the importance of the public school sector as well.
Yes, and you've done a lot of work with the public school sector in the UK, haven't you?
Oh, that's my primary area of work and experience, yeah.
Yes, tell us a bit about that, because I know you've been on a really important body that is working at the Religious Education Council, so you've done a lot of work with public schools, but particularly about getting religious education into these schools. Tell me how that works.
Yeah, well, we have a legal system which has had compulsory religious education enshrined in law as something that every school, public school, must offer from 5 to 16. And that's part of a settlement that's happened way back in 1944 between the government and particularly the churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England. And what it does is give every young person the opportunity to learn about the importance of religious faith in the society as a whole. And during the course of their years at school, they will meet quite a lot of religious traditions, both in the classroom and when they go out on visits to churches or mosques or synagogues and so forth. And I think it's a really exciting contribution that happens in British education. Doesn't get the support that it should do from our politicians, unfortunately, but then we work at that.
Yeah, is it still, I mean, as you say, it was put in place some time ago.
Yeah.
The society's changed enormously. It's much more secular.
Yeah.
Is it still have a place? Do people think of it as having a place? Or is that a case you have to make a lot?
You always have to make the case because society is sort of moving away, both here in Australia and in the UK, from a sort of what people call Christendom model, the idea that we're all Christian here.
Yeah.
So that there is that shift. But the RE curriculum has responded to that, and it became what we call multi-faith in about the 1960s and 70s. And we're undergoing a shift at the moment, which the body that I was involved in has worked on, which is basically working on the philosophy that every young person comes to school with what we call a worldview, a sense of what their core beliefs are, what their core passions are, and those are shaped by their experience and background. And learning to understand those in conversation with the religious traditions of the country so that you are benefiting personally as well as learning about other people. That's the shift that we're trying to encourage, so it becomes a subject for every student.
Yes, this is really, really interesting because there'll be people who'll say, oh yeah, we can look at religions, but from a secular sort of rational position, which is a neutral position, people will want to say. And I think you're trying to argue against that, aren't you?
Yeah, that's what I call the dead butterfly approach, where you pin out the religions on a board and look at them from a sort of distance, but you don't interact with them.
Yeah.
But that seems to me to be limited in its value.
Yeah.
And I would say you need to experience the testimony of the believer. And what we're working on is the resources that enable teachers to bring those testimonies into the classroom so that the pupils can really begin to learn from them and debate and dialogue.
Yes, it's the lived experience of a person who inhabits that.
Absolutely.
Belief.
Yeah, and the word inhabits is really important because, we're all inhabiting these positions of what I would call faith. We're shaped people, and learning to reflect on that for ourselves because of conversations with people who are very different from us it's really important.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a bit more about that because the notion that people can sit sort of objectively and view other people's worldviews but not think carefully about their own is a flawed way of thinking, isn't it? We all have deep commitments that we bring to the table, whatever our belief system is.
Yes, it is, and there is I think it's a misconceived understanding of knowledge which tends to get perpetuated by, say, an examination system which regards assessment as being about ticking off all the facts that you've been able to regurgitate without reflection on them. And there's a bit of a shift in education towards that sort of view of knowledge, but I think that is flawed. I think it lacks humanity.
What are the key worldview messages that people find at a school that has a Christian base?
I think it's about significance. Who are you in this world? Why are you significant? So it's about the developing of identity and understanding of who you are. I think purpose is a really important thing for young people to understand, that reflection on why am I here? And I think things like learning about the importance of relational love and what that means, how to get on and work well with people that you disagree with. We're getting less and less good at that in Western societies, where culture wars is all the rage now, and things like X, formerly called Twitter, they encourage that sort of culture. So offering an alternative to that. So it's that area of growing and flourishing as a human being that I think is important.
You're listening to Life and Faith. Professor Trevor Cooling is my guest. He is an expert in education and particularly teaching worldview to students. Having them understand their own and other people's worldview is a vital element of a healthy pluralist culture. So I wanted to hear what he would say about the engagement of a school that has a Christian foundation and worldview, as it draws in plenty of people who do not share that belief. How can that dynamic work well?
Whatever school you're in, you experience an ethos. There's a fundamental set of values which drive that school, and they'll be set by the senior leaders, by the staff. There's a culture. So every school's doing that. What happens ideally in a faith-based or a Christian school is that that is underpinned by a Christian understanding of what it is to be a human being. And one important element of that is the sense of welcome, creating an environment in which everybody, whatever their own particular faith, will learn to discover the sorts of things that we said about purpose and identity and those sorts of things. So I'd go back to the word nurture again. It's about creating a nurturing environment, because the Christian belief is that everybody has huge significance because of their createdness by God.
Yeah, that's a culture that's probably challenging to develop, but that's a strong sense of that message when everything, including school, comes down to we're measuring ourselves all the time against some other sort of judgment. So I think that's a challenge, isn't it?
It is a challenge, and I don't know about the situation in Australia, but in England there's an issue about students who have particular, what we would call special needs. And the way in which the government assesses schools puts a lot of emphasis on performance. So there's a temptation not to bring in pupils who might struggle a bit more, because they potentially could drag down your performance records a bit. So there are these tensions that exist within the system, and I would hope that a religious foundation school, a Christian school, would really seek to resist that temptation.
Have you seen these sorts of enterprises go badly and end up creating cultures that you think have not been positive contributors?
Yes. And
do you want to describe the shape of that?
Yeah, I have 2 grandchildren who are both very bright, performed very well at 16, but both left school at 16 because they were disillusioned with the very performance-oriented culture, where they felt that they were basically fodder for generating exam results which would enable the school to say we are a high-performing school. And they went off to find different modes of education.
Yes, much to their grandfather's dismay.
Yeah, I was very sad about that. And, seeing sort of Romeo and Juliet taught just so that you've got enough gobbets to quote in the exam, and you're doing that from the age of 14, being drilled to do that for your exam at 16. It's soulless.
You talked a moment ago about knowledge. And when we think about imparting knowledge and our understanding of what that even is, what does the Christian worldview offer? thinking about the way we tend to consider facts and scientific rationalism as proper knowledge. That's a point of contention.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting example of this for me is to take two leading geneticists. So you've got Richard Dawkins and Francis Collins. They're both high-level geneticists. You put them in a lab together, gave them a genetics project to work on, they could do it.
They're going to be good at this.
Yeah, going to be fine because they have a shared understanding of the factual basis of genetics. If you ask them questions about the broader significance of genetics in understanding what it is to be a human being and how that influences the way you behave in the world, in other words, if you begin to interpret the meaning and significance of genetics in human life, you'll get two entirely different presentations of it. Richard Dawkins would see it as from a very atheistic point of view, an evangelistic atheist point of view. Francis Collins would see it from a very Christian point of view, from an evangelistic Christian point of view. And they would find it really difficult to agree on the meaning and significance of genetics in the wider reach of human life. So that's where faith, I think, becomes important because it is about interpretation of the significance of meaning, of the facts that are there, but of themselves don't take you very far.
And so we have a very strong message in our culture that people will say this all the time. Oh, I like a bit of science in the decisions I make or in the big commitments I have. As if it's as simple as that, and as if that's all you need. Yeah. And there is a kind of a faith to the men in the white coat kind of thing, and the people in the white coats. What's the way to kind of speak into that? Because life is so much richer and more interesting than that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had a really good example of that in the UK during COVID, because our Prime Minister, I think some of you will have heard of him, Boris Johnson.
we have indeed.
He kept saying, "I'm following the science."
Yeah.
As though he was just being told what to do by the scientists. And you could see these sort of scientific advisors standing next to him during these press conferences, and they were sort of groaning a bit, and you could see it on their faces. Because what he was doing was actually interpreting and using the science to make political decisions which involved all sorts of economic factors and about the capacity of the health. So it wasn't just following the science. So that, I think, illustrates the sort of importance of actually the faith and cultural dimensions in terms of understanding the facts.
Yes, and trying to help people think through the implications of their belief seems important. And so if you're saying all the time, I just want to know about the facts and so on, the science, it feels to me like you're leaving large parts of life out of that equation.
Yeah, and that's why it's really important that we have a broad curriculum which includes the humanities and the arts and the sports side of all those aspects of life. And one of the difficulties we have in England at the moment, and I'm probably sure you have it here in Australia, is this emphasis on STEM, the idea that all the answers lie in science, technology, engineering and mathematics.
Yes.
And there are answers there, they're really important, but they're not going to give us that sense of what it is to be a human being in the world. They're not going to help us deal relationally with the people around us. Of itself, we won't make salvation out of facts.
Yes, we need more than that. We need poetry and music and understand relationship and what true love is and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Is an education system at least set up to make a contribution to that person's life in that way?
Good schools do, and one of the problems is if the government pushes in a particular direction and overemphasises this STEM aspect, that the schools can forget the fuller experience and focus on just those criteria. And the financial pressures are there because the money tends to go into the STEM area, and some of the structures can work against it. But most head teachers I know don't want to go down there.
You talked a bit about identity earlier. This is a really important part of formation. What can you say that an education that's Christian would be wanting to convey when it comes to identity?
For me, identity, the gift of helping young people search out, develop, understand the identity that they are growing into and developing. That's a gift that we can make if, for example, you think of the notion of their future as a vocation rather than a career. Because the word career narrows the language down to jobs and status and salary, whereas the word vocation encourages them to think broader. Now, you may not use the word vocation to them because it's a sort of slightly funny word, but it's the way in which you help them think about who am I becoming, what's my contribution in the world. And in a Christian environment, that would be something that I would say should certainly be, and often is, up front in the thinking of what's going on in the school.
Trev, you've done a lot of work with this Religious Education Council. That will have put you in touch with and working alongside people with very different views of the world than you. How's that gone? Tell me a bit about that.
It's a great experience. I mean, being in the chair of an organisation where you've got such diverse groups there is, to use the sort of familiar phrase, like herding cats.
Yeah.
But it's a group of people who gather around the shared belief in the importance of there being a subject called religious education in the public school curriculum. So they're all passionate about that. But they all often have very different understandings of what that should look like. And you find yourself negotiating with people who have fundamentally opposed beliefs to you. So, for example, one of the key organisations that are part of the council is the Humanists UK. And when I was in the chair, my treasurer was the policy officer from Humanists UK. Now, one of his roles was to campaign against the existence of church schools. One of my roles as a professor of Christian education was to help church schools perform better and understand their role. So
no tension in this.
No
then?
tension at all. But so our daytime roles were to unseat each other's views. But actually, we found ourselves working together in that shared commitment to the importance of conversation about the religious dimension. And they wanted humanism in there as well, I agreed with that. But it showed that it's possible to work what I call in coalition around a shared goal, even though you may have very different understandings of the world.
So you were optimistic about how that can go. What was the key to making that work, do you think?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, but I'm very aware it's
Realistic.
very fragile.
Yeah.
It's very fragile. I think the key to that being able to work is probably two things. One is respect for other people. You have to develop respect and learn to trust other people. The other is sometimes people use the word compromise. I don't like that word. As a Christian, I would talk about what is the most redemptive outcome possible in this situation. And what I mean by that is that you're seeking to achieve things that are the best that can be achieved from your own perspective in a complex situation. And often that's less than perfect, but it's worth doing for other reasons.
In modern Western societies, it's become a bit alarming how much loneliness is a problem these days. There's a minister for loneliness in the UK, I understand. Is it that educational institutions can play an even greater role in formation of community that people hunger for?
I think that's very important, yeah. And some set out to do it very deliberately. So some of the large independent schools that I've worked in have a very strong culture that's lifelong. So when you go and watch the rugby teams play, the guys next year are in their 70s and still supporting the school rugby team.
Yeah.
Other schools will find that harder to do, but that's where the building of relational skills becomes very important, and particularly the attention to young people who may struggle. So, for example, autistic young people can struggle. I mean, I have an autistic grandson, and finding a place in community was one of his salvations, if I can use that word. But it was really hard work for him, really hard work. And people and teachers worked with him on helping him develop the skills necessary. And people learning how to work well together, that's a contribution that education is making, which is profoundly important, I think, to the health of society.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Thanks for listening, and thanks to those who've been writing in with ideas or feedback. We really appreciate that and love hearing from you. You can always do that by going to podcast@publicchristianity.org. And if you're enjoying Life and Faith, why not send an episode to a friend and let them know that they'd be mad to miss this important podcast that literally everyone is into these days. You can become our best advertisement, and we can help grow the Life and Faith community. Thanks to Trevor Cooling for giving us some time during his stay in Australia, where he has been in high demand. And thanks to our producer, who would neatly fit the description that schools love to use, the lifelong learner, Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
In the United States, there are 53 surgeons per 100,000 population. In Australia, there's 44 surgeons per 100,000. In Africa, there's 1. So they've got a huge need for surgeons. And the problem also there that many of these surgeons are in the cities. So for the general population, for 90% of the population, they've got no access to any surgery.